Hey, welcome back to the channel. It is time for another short story of exactly 1,000 words, inspired by a piece of artwork written on the spot. And this week's short story is a unique one because it was not only inspired by artwork, but inspired by setting, because I recently got back, yesterday in fact, from a nearly 2-week long trip out in Europe, in Scandinavia, where I landed in Copenhagen, Denmark, drove up through Sweden, all the way to Norway, back down again to fly out of Copenhagen to arrive back in the United States yesterday. And while I did pre-record one of these videos so I would have one released the week I was gone, that meant I had to have another one written for today to release today. And I wrote it on the trip, and I'm very glad I did. I was initially planning on writing both of them ahead of time so I wouldn't have to worry about it, but I'm a bit of a procrastinator, what can I say? So on my trip, I stopped in a small town for one night, and we stayed in this kind of a farmhouse, actually, on the coast of Sweden, the southern west coast of Sweden, and had this beautiful view of the ocean outside of this window. There was a little writing desk here. So I set my laptop up and got to work, just inspired by my surroundings. And that actually drove me to choose this artwork, honestly, because it popped up in the feed and it seemed to fit the setting and sort of my headspace at the time. And I even got to meet one of my subscribers, a good friend now, who so generously led us around his city of Gothenburg. So thanks again, man, for doing that. I had an absolute blast meeting you and hanging out, and thank you again for the Swedish dishcloths. I will get much use out of it. And I also learned something else of the Scandinavians. They love their shoehorns. And when I first found out about that, I thought it was kind of odd because in the United States, we don't really use them. We have these little shoehorns you can sometimes find in shoe stores, but people don't typically keep them at their houses. But in Sweden, nearly all of the places, I believe, or maybe it was all of the places I stayed, there was a shoehorn hanging by the door near a little rack where people would take off their shoes. And I tried one. Yes, I tried one, and I immediately fell in love. So I bought one. I have now a Swedish shoehorn hanging near my door, right by where all of our shoes are. And if you're unfamiliar with this, it's not a little shoehorn. It's a very long shoehorn. It's one you could use while standing up and putting on your shoes. So thank you for introducing me to that. It is a tool that I'm just not sure how I ever got by without. But I'm telling you this story because I'm sure you know that your environment affects the way you write or create. And most of us are stuck in rooms in front of computers, so we don't always have a great view out of a window. And so I decided to take advantage of that because I was completely inspired by the view and the location, and I did not want to waste it. So this story is a little bit dreamy. It's a little bit incoherent, I guess, kind of a meditative journey of a character in a beautiful landscape. And I think it really reflects sort of my headspace at the time of where I was and what I was thinking and what I was feeling. But we'll talk more about that in the analysis. That brings us to the soundtrack of the story. And what I listened to is the Eidolon official soundtrack. It is a soundtrack for a video game, which is very reminiscent of the Swedish countryside, as well as the artwork. It's kind of a game where you're just roaming this beautiful landscape and discovering things. It's not about winning or losing or fighting monsters. It's just about hanging out and relaxing a little bit. And this soundtrack was composed by Michael Bell. So why don't you cue it up, relax a bit, and let's check out this week's artwork. This week's artwork is titled Traveler, and it's by a freelance artist named Alarico from Spain. And this is a very idyllic setting. We have a figure wearing a cloak, and it looks like holding a walking stick, heading toward a quaint little house in the distance. And around is a massive meadow or meadows with blooming flowers. We have trees running along a broken wall. But more than anything, towering, looming over this entire scene is a massive cloud just dominating the sky completely. I chose this one because of where I was. I was in environments such as these and inspired by it. And so I thought, let me try to capture that feeling and the experience and then couple that with the artwork. Alarico, thank you so much for the inspiring artwork. So with that said, let's see what I came up with. He had chosen the old ways, he with no name. He with a name once, though never scribed, though never etched, so ever forgotten. The old ways were this: leave, remember, return, forget. He contemplated these 4 tenets while grass probed the splits and holes in his sandals, if they were ever his at all, while a palette of flowers bent in the wind as if acknowledging his passing, his returning, while trees plumped along a white stone fence, all bathing in the shower of the sun, while a house sat at the center of these majesties, its broadest wall facing him with nothing but a window and a chimney, a raised hand as if waving goodbye or hello. But towering in bulbs of churned cream ruled a cloud. Too small a word, he decided. 5 letters weren't enough to describe what he saw, what gave him pause in the meadow of flower and tree and home. Home. Leave, remember, return, forget. The 4 came to him again, with the wind that tousled his hair, which had grown long with curls, billowed his cloak, which had grown weary in thread, forging the air into knives to whittle his flesh. He waited in the center of the meadow, if there was one, looking for a path he had trod when he had left, because he had left here. He remembered. Or was it the 4 playing tricks on him, giving him hope? Because they knew that he was worn thin, his body naked to their eyes, and his soul all but naked as well, because his skin was worn thin too. He tried to remember more. The flowers, the trees, the white wall divided by faulty stones. Had he placed those stones? The house itself did nothing to jostle free the treasures the spiders had trapped in their webs, and sucked dry and wrapped their empty shells in silk. The spiders had what he sought in their bellies, swirling with a head of scarlet hair and rose-kissed cheeks, with a doll hand reaching for his with pale and eager fingers, with a cold nose, and the spiders folded their legs and closed their eyes, and all was lost to him. The 2nd had given him all it would. He broke his petrification by taking a step toward the house that stared at him with its empty window, where a child of its own, small and feeble and in shadow, lurked at its side with an eye of its own. Not a window, a door, a passage, into his home, where he wouldn't need memories, where what the spiders held existed in flesh and bone and blood. Return, the 3rd. It should have ended at 3. 4 are 2 pairs, and 2 pairs can separate and still not be alone. Odds were more pleasing. 1 in the center, 2 to either side, where no matter which left, 1 would be alone. He had been the one left alone, so he had to be the one to return. Could the 2, if there were 2 at all, still be here? He had left, after all, but that was his calling, his duty, his purpose. A traveler must leave to return to. He would not utter the 4th. He would not think of it. But the letters of its making formed in the shadows of the trees, in the patterns of the flowers, in the bulbs of the cloud. Everywhere he looked, it lurked. He was without armor in this meadow, without shelter, though a shelter stood near. He gripped his walking stick and worked his gnarled fingers over its gnarls to massage the courage from it he could not muster. Perhaps it was more than a walking stick. Perhaps it could call forth fire from the below. Perhaps it could sprout a blade and rend the 4th in 2. Perhaps it was just a walking stick, and perhaps that was enough. All he had left to do was walk, after all. The shelter hadn't moved, and he had moved 1 step. Why did he call it a shelter? It was a home, his home. Remember. No. He had journeyed to the 2nd already. He couldn't go back, mustn't go back. It was forbidden, shunned. He would be shunned. Return. He had returned, was still returning, tangled in the woven grass that had become a ribbon to lure him, that had become a rope to ensnare him. He took another step, and his sandal split in 2. 2 is a pair. He shook his head, he shook his fists. He shook the walking stick over his head, anticipating lightning to bolt from the great cloud on white spider legs, so broken yet precise to smite him. All that happened was nothing. He lowered his arms, lowered his gaze, and took another step, the sandal leaving that foot as well. He staked his walking stick through the flowers and grass, deep into the soil and grubs. A connection was there, rooting him. He let go of it all. He strode to the house with nothing but his cloak and the spiders in his mind, who had drunk his memories, cocooned the shells. Those cocoons of what used to belong to him unfurled into ribbons not unlike the ones that had paved his path to this house, this home. Each step unfurled another, until his mind was full of shreds, colored with a palette of the meadow's flowers, which bobbed on swells of grass. The structure sat patiently beneath a cloud like no other, sculpted by the gods. Everything so lush in its beauty, like a painting made just for him, a man with no name, who had chosen the old ways. To inspire travel, for he was a traveler. To capture the memory of home, for it was his home. To abstract reality enough to separate him from what it truly was. To make him forget. He dropped his walking stick and stepped inside. Welcome to the End Reviewer. I am so glad you made it. This is where I talk about my final thoughts, what I liked, what I didn't like, maybe what I learned, and give a little bit more context to the story, a little bit more background, more than I talked about in the intro, or at least I will try to. So let us get right into the writing itself. And our protagonist, our unnamed protagonist, had chosen the old way. So you will know by now that this story was not only inspired by the artwork, but inspired by my view and the setting where I wrote the story. There's very little conflict in the image. We have an individual who is facing a small house in this beautiful meadow with trees and a little bit of a wall off to the side. More than anything is this massive cloud looking down over all of this majesty. And it's a little bit fantastical. It appears as if this could be in a fantasy setting. We have a character wearing a cloak, holding a walking stick or a staff of some kind. And so that immediately made me think of some kind of ancient tenets, maybe. I don't know. The artwork is titled Traveler, so I immediately thought, of course, he is a traveler. He is going from one place to another. But rather than him going to this destination as a new destination or a fresh location, I just randomly thought about these four old ways, which were leave, remember, return, forget. I have no idea where they came from. They just popped into my head. I wrote them out as I was thinking about it, and that really informed the structure of this story. I didn't adhere to it in a linear fashion, but it did, as you will see as we get through this, all of the areas where it was inspired and how it informed the character's headspace. So let us begin at the beginning. So he had chosen the old ways, which we know are leave, remember, return, forget. And I gave him no name because he's looking away from this camera, right? We don't see his face ever. There's no identity, so to speak. And so that is why I decided to make this person nameless. He with a name once, though never scribed, though never etched, so ever forgotten. And you can tell here that the writing style is a little bit dreamy. It's a little bit poetic. It's maybe a little bit purple, I guess. But again, I think that was just my headspace at the time. It was seeing this image and maybe what someone in this headspace in this world would be thinking as well, in the context or the confines that I had given it, which are these old ways, these old four tenets. And so we have our character contemplating these four tenets. And again, this is where the dreaminess sort of begins, as I was describing the landscape. And I added this small detail where the grass probed the splits and holes in his sandals. So that just signifies that he's been journeying a very long time. I wanted it to feel as if he'd been gone for a considerable amount of time and just returning to this location. And so that's what that description was for. But anyway, while a palette of flowers bent in the wind as if acknowledging his passing, his returning, while trees plumped along a white stone fence, all bathing in the shower of the sun, while a house sat at the center of these majesties, its broadest wall facing him, with nothing but a window and a chimney, a raised hand as if waving goodbye or hello. So I did a little bit of personification there, you could call it. Because while I was looking at this image, this artwork, I was trying to think of like, well, how would the environment call to him? How would he be perceiving this? Because there are no other characters here. We just have trees, we have grass, we have a little wall, we have this house. And so I'm sure you can guess that if you've ever been away from home for a long time, there's just something very comforting about seeing your house. I was only gone for about 2 weeks, but you know, pulling up to my driveway, it felt good. It felt good, even though I really loved the trip and everywhere I went. But then before I finish, I move on and talk about this towering in bulbs of churned cream ruled a cloud. Too small a word, he decided. 5 letters weren't enough to describe what he saw. What gave him pause in this meadow of flower and tree and home. And so this is when he's remembering. Right? So we know that he's already left because he's coming back. He is remembering or trying to remember, and he is also returning right now. But then we have this fourth thing called forget. And you'll see that I tried to create sort of a conflict with these 4 tenets here. So I have him calling upon or describing some of these, but then almost like in a battle, a conflict, trying to almost push them away because he knows he has to adhere to them, but he's he's fighting it a bit on his own. And I'd say my one regret is I wish I would have given more importance or significance to the cloud, because the cloud is such a dominating feature in this painting. And I just kind of left it as set dressing. So I think if I were to write this all over again, I would try to center it somewhat around that cloud, because, you know, clearly it's a focal point in this. And then I decided to give these things a proper nouns, and I'm not sure if this came over so well in the audio, because you don't know when I'm calling something a proper noun, but he calls them the four. They came to him again with a wind that tousled his hair, which had grown long with curls. And so here I'm starting to describe not only what he looks like, but how he feels, right? Because we have this cloak, which has grown weary in thread, and it's forging the air into knives to whittle his flesh. So we know this guy he's beaten down. He's had a very long road, a very long journey, and he's finally coming to home, at least what he thinks is his home. But he's waiting there. He's reluctant. He's standing in the center of this meadow, but he's remembering, right? This is the paragraph, or one of the paragraphs, where he's just kind of bouncing these ideas around his head. They're coming to him. They're fleeting. Because he had left here, he remembered, or was it the four playing tricks on him, giving him hope because they knew that he was worn thin, his body naked to their eyes. So he just feels like he's a specimen here, to be scrutinized, to be played with by these strange old tenants, the old ways. And he tried to remember more. He's looking at all of these things, the flowers, the trees, the white wall divided by faulty stones. How do you place those stones? So he's starting to think like, did I make this home? Did I build this wall? Is this truly my place? And in this next section, I get a little bit dreamier or symbolic here, where the house itself did nothing to jostle free the treasures the spiders had trapped in their webs and sucked dry and wrapped their empty shells in silk. So I probably could have been a little bit more specific there, with these sort of, again, personifying these things in his head that are hiding away these memories. But the spiders had what he sought in their belly, swirling with a head. And this is when I really, the only time I specifically address some of his memories. Swirling with a head of scarlet, hair and rose-kissed cheeks, with a doll hand reaching for his, with pale and eager fingers, with a cold nose, and then we stop short. And I do that a couple times because it's him forgetting. It's something getting in the way of his thought processes, of him remembering, of him reacting. And then we have the spiders folding the legs and closing their eyes, and all was lost. And the second, so I did, give that a proper noun as well, which is remember. So he's forgetting. But he decides to move forward. He starts stepping forward. He breaks his petrification by taking a step toward this house that stared at him with his empty window. And again, more personification here, where a child of its own, small and feeble and in shadow, lurked at its side with an eye of its own. So again, I think I could have been a little bit more specific here, clear to let you know that it's the side of the house with the doorway, not necessarily a child. But it is not a window, it is a door, a passage into his home where he wouldn't need the memories, because, if he returns there, these things that are haunting him or that he's trying to reach are already there, or at least he hopes. And then finally, we get to the third, return. The third, it should have ended at 3 for our 2 pairs. And this is a strange thing I did. It just, again, I'm free writing this stuff. It's just coming out of my mind onto the page. And I imagine these 4 or 2 pairs. So we have the 4, which are the old ways, these 4 tenants. And then 2 pairs can separate and still not be alone. And so I thought, because he is alone, it'd be interesting if I played with that number a bit, right? And so, and we also know that odds are more visually pleasing. So if you're doing layout and design of some kind, you want 3, you don't want 4. You want 5, you don't want 6, because something about the symmetry just doesn't sit right with this. And so that's why he says odds were more pleasing. And this is kind of a bittersweet thing, because there's 1 at the center, 2 on either side, and no matter which one left, 1 would be alone. And he had been the one who left. He had been the one who had been alone. So he had to be the one returned. But could the 2, if there were 2 at all, still be there? He had left after all, but that was his calling, his duty, a purpose. And this is when I first named him as the traveler. A traveler must leave to return to what? He didn't want to utter the 4th, because what is the 4th? The 4th is forget. And he knew that if he was going to figuratively travel down that path, all of this would be lost to him. And so he's really trying to hold back. And again, that's where the conflict is in the story. It's with himself. It's interior conflict. It's using these 4 tenets almost personified as well as these guardians, I guess, of these thresholds. And so he's trying not to think of it. He would not think of it, but the letters of its making formed in the shadows of the trees. So even these, again, his surroundings are not only he's trying to use them to remember, but they are contributing to him forgetting. He sees it in the patterns, in the bulbs of the cloud. Everywhere he looked, it lurked. And he was naked without his armor in the meadow, without shelter, though a shelter stood near. And so he's contemplating what to do next, right? He's gripping this staff. He's He's rubbing his fingers over it. But what else is it? Maybe it's more than a walking stick. Who is he? Maybe he has some kind of power. He starts thinking about this, right? Is it able to call forth the fire from the below? Perhaps it could sprout a blade and rend the forth in two. Perhaps it was just a walking stick, and perhaps that was enough, because again, he's not a warrior. He doesn't seem to be, but he's wondering. He doesn't quite know. And honestly, his most powerful weapon in this situation is a walking stick, because he needs to get to this house. He needs to get to his home, or what he thinks is his home. And he goes back to remember, but no, he had journeyed to the second already. So again, he's confined to these four, not only the four, but the order of the four. So he had journeyed to the second already. He couldn't go back, mustn't go back. He'd be shunned, essentially. But then he keeps going all over the place. So now he's back in the return. He had returned, was still returning. He's again fighting this fourth one, which is forget. And then he raises his staff and imagines a lightning bolt is going to crash into it, but all that happened was nothing. And he lowered his arms, lowered his gaze, and took another step, and his sandal is leaving his foot. So it's almost a separation. That's what I was trying to do, is not only show the fact that he's traveled for a very long time, but that this is a metaphor for him transforming into something else, into someone else. And I further emphasize that when he stabs his walking stick into the ground, he sticking it through the flowers and the grass, deep into the soil and the grubs. A connection was there rooting him. That is exactly the key phrase. And then he let go, all of it. He strode to the house with nothing but his cloak and the spiders in his mind. And I believe that was a little bit of a mistake, because I said he staked his walking stick through the flowers, and then I end it with he dropped it. So I'll probably have to fix that a little bit. I do like this final line, but let's not quite get ahead of ourselves. So finally, he's made a decision. He's powered through this. He hasn't completely forgotten, or has he? We don't know yet. And then what I do in this last paragraph, or the second to last paragraph, is I try to bring it back to the beginning. I start to describe the environment. I use their power to help guide him, but also explain who he is. His mind was full of shreds, colored with the pallor of the meadows flowers, which bobbed on swells of grass. The structure sat patiently beneath the cloud like another, sculpted by the gods, everything so lush in its beauty, like a painting made just for him. A man with no name, who had chosen the old ways to inspire travel, for he was a traveler, to capture the memory of a home, for it was his home, to abstract reality enough to separate him from what it truly was, to make him forget the fourth and final tenet. And he dropped his walking stick and stepped inside. I wanted to leave it open-ended because I didn't want to describe what he found, if he found anything at all. I think there's a power in what is unsaid, and I think it really was fitting for this, because did he forget? Is that why that's all that's here? Did I not describe it because of that reason? Or did I do it as a means to let you fill in the blanks and sort of concoct your own conclusion to this thing? But that is the story. Hope you enjoyed it. I think there's some things I could fix, like the cloud, maybe giving it a little bit more of a presence, I guess, and or a function in the story, because it is so large. And I think that the artist rendered it that way because it is a focal point of sorts, and I didn't necessarily make it a focal point. A couple of times with a lightning bolt, the potential of a lightning bolt hitting him when he shakes the staff over his head, and then just the fact that it's dominating the frame. But I think I could do a little bit more. And I think there's some lines here that I can clean up, I can clarify a little bit. And then also this part at the end where he stakes his walking stick, but then he drops it at the end. So some minor stuff to clean up, but overall I enjoyed where it went. Again, it was kind of, representing a certain headspace I was in, and I just wanted to write something that kind of, again, made you feel like when you're playing that game, you're just kind of exploring this beautiful landscape. You're caught in this dream state, almost a daydream, and with no conflict whatsoever. I had to create it, and so I created these four tenets, these old ways, for him to have an internal struggle with them. But if you have any questions, any comments, I'd love to hear it in the comment section below or on my Discord. So if you're not there, join it, and we can talk in more detail about all kinds of things. But thanks for hanging out with me, as always, and keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye. If you'd like to read the story in its non-video format, check the link in the description. I didn't edit anything else, promise. Thanks again.